There we go. All right, everyone. Thank you again for attending. Welcome. Let's begin by welcoming everyone to our webinar today, Teaching Foundational Pre-K Skills Through Active Play and Problem Solving. We are so happy to have you here tonight. I am Melissa Knowles, your host. I have worked with Social Studies School Service for several years and am currently a librarian at a school designated for pre-K and kindergarten, which is one of two schools in Alabama that have just this clientele that we get to interact with every day, but it is a fun time. Tonight, our presenter, I'm excited to introduce her. Her name is Anne Gadzikowski.
That's
Yay.
exactly right. Thank
I
you.
practiced. I'm always afraid to mess up people's names. Oh. Anne is an author. She's an educator and an advocate with a passion for challenging children to think creatively and critically. Her recent book, Creating a Beautiful Mess, 10 Essential Play Experiences for a Joyous Childhood. I love that. But it won a gold in the National Parenting Publication Awards. She's a graduate of the Erickson Institute, and Anne has more than 25 years experience as a teacher and director of early childhood programs. She's an author of curriculum books, teaching guides, classroom readers, and numerous publications for parents and young children. Anne's work with children embraces both the arts and the sciences. Her credentials in music and literature inform her work as executive director of Preschool of the Arts, a Reggio Emilia inspired school in Madison, Wisconsin, and also developed expertise in robotics, computer science, and engineering through her role as an elementary early childhood educational coordinator at Northwestern University's Center for Talent Development. I love that because I love technology. Anne is also a frequent speaker at professional conferences, such as the National Association for Education of Young Children and the National Association for Gifted Children. Anne teaches early childhood education courses at Oakton Community College, and she provides frequent training and consultation for schools and early childhood organizations. In her current role as Director of Early Learning at Encyclopedia Britannica, Anne leads digital learning initiatives for young children and their families. Anne, you are extremely qualified. I cannot wait to learn from you tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the session over to you.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. I really appreciate that. Welcome, everybody. I'm very excited to speak with you about play this evening. I'm very passionate about play, so that's going to be at the center of our conversation. This is a relatively small group. There'll be a couple of times where I'm going to ask for engagement or input from you all. Either you can type into the comments or the chat, or if you really want to speak up, I'm really open to sharing the microphone with you. So let's cross those bridges when we get there. But I think the first thing I'd like to do is welcome and introductions. And I'd like to introduce you first to Happy Puppy, who's on the screen. This was a drawing from one of my students, one of my pre-K students. So meet Happy Puppy. And about me, Melissa was so kind to already describe my background. So this is a little repetitive, but I'll choose the things that I think are most relevant to what we're going to talk about tonight. At Northwestern University, a lot of my focus was on STEM learning, science, technology, engineering, and math. At the university, we had an advisory group of faculty in robotics and engineering, and that was a great opportunity. At Preschool of the Arts, that was a Reggio Emilia inspired program, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Reggio Emilia this evening. So I hope some of you are curious or experienced in Reggio Emilia. School for Little Children is just kind of my core experience as a community-based early childhood educator. It's a school here in the Chicago area My daughter went there when she was a little girl. She's in her 20s now. And I worked there as a director and as a teacher. And the picture you saw on the very first slide was my STEM enrichment class that I was just teaching last year before the lockdown. So that's a recent experience for me at School for Little Children. And I lead a double life. So I work directly with children and families as much as I can, but I'm also a writer and editor, and a lot of that work I've done it as a freelancer on the side. Right now, I'm working for the National Association for the Education of Young Children on the new revision to developmentally appropriate practices. So this is their, position statement on appropriate education and care of young children. It's been revised a couple of times, and it's the new edition of the fourth edition of the book is about to come out, and I've been working as a freelancer on that. So that's been an honor to do that work. I have several books that I published with Red Leaf Press, Creating a Beautiful Mess, for parents, but also most recently for teachers. My newest book is called Young Architects at Play, and it focuses on STEM activities using block play. Encyclopedia Britannica, my primary project is a website called Britannica for Parents. Look it up. There are a lot of free resources for families. And then Pre-K Story Path, which is social studies focus, which is what I'm going to talk about a lot about this evening. I have served as an editor on Pre-K Story Path units. So that's about me. So what about you? I'm hoping that you could chime in and write in the comments or the chat where you are, what part of the country you're in, or your city, and what grade or age level do you teach? I'm assuming a lot of you are pre-K because that's in the title of our session, but maybe you teach kids a little bit older, a little bit younger, and what type of setting, Head Start or public school setting, community-based childcare setting, what kind of setting are you in? So I'll pause for a moment. Maybe Melissa, you could read some of those as
Absolutely.
people chime in.
So Jen is a TOSA in California working with TK to 8th grade. So what is TK? Maybe more people know, but I'm not familiar with that.
That's
So
traditional kindergarten.
Okay. Okay, awesome. All right. Lucy is from Modesto, California. She's an early Head Start. She works with toddlers. It went too fast. Camber, great name, is from Claremont, Oklahoma. She's in a public school half-day pre-K. Jocelyn is a child find coordinator and speech language pathologist in Colorado. Megan is a speech and language pathologist in Massachusetts and works in an integrated preschool. Hope Nera, hope I did not mess that up, is in Cold Springs, Minnesota at a preschool. She's a childcare preschool site leader. Karen is in Greenwich County Day School in Greenwich, Connecticut. She's at an independent N through 12th grade. She's an assistant nursery teacher. Her first year. Congratulations, Karen. Way to start in the pandemic. That's probably a fun time, huh? Maha Zamil is a pre-K through 3rd grade teacher in a public school in New Jersey. Abby is working in Oakwood, Virginia at pre-K. Stephanie Barnhill is the director of Early Learning Academy, is a pre-K 3 and 4-year-olds in Spring Hill School District, Spring Hill, Kansas. So we are spanning the country. Michelle is in Columbia, South Carolina. She's a curriculum consultant for early childhood education, I'm thinking. So I bet, yes, there it is. I've done that, Michelle. You hit enter and whoop, there it goes, or something. I've done that before. Karen, she says hi to everyone. So Karen Feeney is the director of early childhood for Watertown Public, just outside Boston, and her students are ages 3 through 5. Well, Hazamel, I thought I already had done that one, but she's in New Jersey at a public school, full day pre-K 4-year-olds. Sandy Turner is pre-K at a public school in Grundy, Virginia. And Edwina, she works in Pennsylvania at Bucks County Intermediate Unit Regional Ed Agency as the Director of Teaching, Learning, and Staff Development. She facilitates an advisory council called Tender Bridges Advisory Council, which is an early childhood collaboration of school districts, higher ed, childcare, and preschools. And I love that name, Tender Bridges. Great. So I think that's all the people that responded.
Great. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for taking the time. It's really good to know that there's such a mix of roles and settings, and even a little bit of a range in terms of the age range that we're talking about. So that's really helpful for me to know moving forward. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to start with the power of stories. We're going to talk about learning through play. We're going to look specifically at social studies content and how we can use stories and play to teach social studies content. We're also going to look at mapping and spatial reasoning, because it's really interesting the ways social studies content and math content can be so closely connected, especially with the little ones. And then as we wrap up, we're going to talk about how all this really does address the standards, the expectations that we have, the check boxes that we need to check in order to be accountable for the work that we're doing with children. So we'll be sure to include that at the end. And we'll hopefully have a little time left at the end for questions, but you can chime in the chat with questions as we go along. So let's start out with the power of stories. The picture on the screen is me when I was in my first year of teaching, and I was teaching preschool at a community-based childcare center. And I was sitting on the floor reading a story to the children. And I had this one little guy who just had to sit in my lap, even if it meant he had to look all the way up to the sky to see the picture. And I think I'm reading Rapunzel. You know, in the picture I'm looking, I'm like, I think I remember reading that fairy tale. So I think I'm reading Rapunzel. So I love that picture because it reminds me of the joy I had of discovering teaching that first year and the importance of stories. So let's, again, I'm going to invite you for some inputs. So think about when you were a child. Were stories important to you when you were a child? I bet they were. Not just because they're important to everyone, which I think that they are, but most early childhood people that I meet have picture books and stories that are really a favorite for them. So if you wouldn't mind typing into the chat, what was your favorite story when you were a little girl, or not just a little girl, sorry, when you were a child? And I have already chosen one, as you can see from the picture there, Where the Wild Things Are. And you guys can see me in the little corner of the screen, right? I'm just holding up a copy of Where the Wild Things Are, which was written and illustrated by Maurice Sendak. So this was one of my favorite stories. And of course, it was one of my favorite stories to read to children as a teacher and to my own child too. So Melissa, what are some of the comments? What were some favorite stories from our participants?
I've got to tell you, I don't think I could fit a favorite. I don't think I could pick a favorite, especially being a librarian now. But The Paper Bag Princess by Robert Munsch has been added. The Giving Tree, I Love You Forever, Frog and Toad Together, Good Night Moon, Goldilocks, Fox and Socks, any of the Berenstain Bear books. I love, love, love to read, says Abby. My favorite story was Jack and the Beanstalk.
Oh, yeah.
Rainbow Fish, yes.
Oh, Rainbow Fish. I haven't thought of Rainbow Fish for a long time.
I'm thinking maybe Velveteen Rabbit. Megan says, all of these I can't pick. Lucy said, I love you, Stinky Face. Oh, yes, yes.
Oh, nice. All right, well, keep those in your heart as we move forward, because we're going to talk about what stories really mean and how to use stories as a teaching tool. So stories as a teaching tool. So once upon a time, I have this fun story of a very frustrating day as a preschool teacher. And it was winter time in Chicago, and it was snowy outside, and I was taking my group of preschoolers, 3-year-olds, it was a 3-year-old class, to the park. And of course, we had to get our snow pants on, and we had to get our boots on, and we had to get our jackets on. And it was just kind of bedlam. And everybody was almost ready to go. Some kids were getting hot and they were crying, and other kids weren't quite ready yet. And I had two other people on my team who were helping the children get ready, but it's like, we have to start kind of corralling these kids and getting them out the door. And to get everyone's attention in the middle of this mess, I don't know why I did this. It just kind of came to me. I kind of hollered out, "Once upon a time," and everybody stopped and looked at me to see what I had to say. I was like, okay, I better come up with something. So I said, "Once upon a time, it was a snowy day in Chicago, and the 3-year-olds in the red room really wanted to go outside. But before they could go outside, they had so much work to do. They had to check their snow pants and make sure that they were zipped up, and they had to check their boots and make sure that their snow pants were tucked into their boots." And I kind of went through the checklist of things that they were supposed to do. And they listened to every word. And it was all because I had framed it as a story. I had said "once upon a time." And so it was kind of a magical moment. And I'll tell you, I never did it again, because I felt like I didn't want to ruin that special thing. Like, I felt like if I did that every time we had to go outside, then it wouldn't be special anymore. And I wanted to kind of keep it as special. But it was a lesson to me about how great it is when you frame something as a story. So there's all kinds of research about this. There are anthropologists who have done research, there's psychologists. Jerome Bruner, I don't know if any of you have read any of his work. I read some Jerome Bruner when I was in graduate school and early childhood, talked about the importance of narratives, how children use stories, or we all do, adults too, use stories to make sense of our world. One of the writers and educators that I really admire is Vivian Paley. And she was a teacher at the University of Chicago Lab School for a long, long time. She wrote, I think, 20 books. She was a MacArthur Genius Scholar. One of her best known books is Wally's Stories, where she writes about her experience in the classroom with story dictation and story acting with young children. And I think this incident was from Wally's story, but it reminds me of the story I already told you, which is there was the little boy, I think it was Wally, was having trouble following the rules at school. He was one of these kids that now we would say they have challenging behaviors. So I don't know if it was because she was frustrated or because she had a really good idea, but she said to him one day, "Wally, pretend that you're a boy who knows how to follow the rules at school." And he did. Not for long, but for a little while. So within the frame of a pretend story, this little boy was able to pull himself together and pretend to be a little boy who knew how to follow the rules at school. So both Vivian's story and my story are kind of anecdotes to give you this proof that stories work, that stories, and I bet you have stories like that yourself too. You're probably thinking of some in your head. But another person who is really great at using stories to teach is Margaret McGuire, and she is a well-known on the national level social studies curriculum teacher and developer. She's based at Seattle University, and she was president of National Council of Social Studies, and she's done all kinds of great leadership things across the country, and she's just a really terrific person. And Margaret developed a curriculum approach called StoryPath, and she's published a ton of units, curriculum units using the StoryPath approach. A lot of them are for older kids. So if you think about kind of core or classic social studies content, civics lessons, she's taken those and turned them into StoryPath units where we use stories, role playing to teach a unit. So for example, she's got a unit on the presidential election where you take on the roles of candidates in an election. Coming to America, you take on the roles of immigrants. Safari to Kenya, the rainforest, different environments and ecosystems. So she came up with this framework where you can teach social studies to children as old as middle school and high school using stories. And she has kind of a structure to her approach. The arc of a narrative. So when you're reading a novel, if you're reading a really good story, there's going to be an arc to it where the story builds and comes to a height and then resolves. That's kind of a classic way that stories are told or built. So Margaret used that arc. She used that shape of the story to create a curriculum unit. So there's the introduction, there's the creation of the characters, and the children may take on the role of the characters depending on how you're using the curriculum in the classroom, creating a setting by drawing or painting the environment around you in the classroom, building context where you're doing research and you're going deeper and you're learning more about what's happening, solving a problem. There's always some kind of crisis or problem in a really good story. You can't have a story where everything's happy all the time, right? Like there has to be something interesting. And then a conclusion. So that's the shape of the story path method that Margaret Maguire created. And we can apply that to young students as well, with stories, with narratives, with role playing. And what happens is when we use stories to teach young children, there's all kinds of language and literacy that comes out, not just social studies. The psychologist, the Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky, he has this great quote about children in play, where he says, in play, a child always behaves beyond his average age, above his daily behavior. In play, it is as though he were a head taller than himself. And I think about that in terms of the language that children use when they're telling stories and when they're pretending. So even just a phrase like once upon a time, like that storybook language, it has kind of an elegance to it that children wouldn't ordinarily use in daily conversation. Or some of the specialized vocabulary that happens during pretend play. You have a 3 or a 4-year-old and they're pretending to cook dinner for you. And they say, hand me that spatula. And you know, they wouldn't ordinarily use a word like spatula, and yet they're challenged to use these special words and this new vocabulary when they're telling stories and when they're pretending. And then of course, problem solving, like I said, something always goes wrong. Whenever you're teaching, something will always go wrong. So just assume that it will, but then use that as an opportunity to make your story more complicated and turn it into a teachable moment. And then of course the social studies content, because like the classic social studies concepts are stories themselves. You think about people, places, and communities. Like you can't talk about people, places, and communities without telling stories. So the social studies content is really naturally embedded in stories when we're using pretend play and stories to teach young children. And then interestingly, I think this is, for me, I'm just speaking for myself, but for me, I didn't really think that much about spatial reasoning until the last couple of years. Like I'm seeing this as kind of a hot topic in educational literature. So spatial reasoning, geography, and mapping is so closely tied to social studies. And I used to think that pre-K children were too young to learn about geography and mapping, and I have changed my mind. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today as well. So those are all the things that young children can learn through stories. So let's look at an example. There are several units of Margaret's story path approach that are specific to pre-K, and one of them is called the post office. So you know, the post office, again, is kind of a hot topic these days, right? I just heard something on the news about mail being slow. And, you know, there have been times where I thought, well, I can't really, you know, play post office with the children these days, because who sends a letter anymore? Like everything's email. Is this even really relevant for young children? But I think one of the things we've learned in the pandemic is there's something really special about hard copies and tangible materials, because we're so swamped with digital experiences as we're isolated or as we are remote learning. There becomes something almost sacred about the physical paper letters and books and things that we can actually hold in our hands. So I think a unit on the post office is actually probably more relevant than ever, and so many opportunities for literacy through doing a unit on the post office. So using the arc of the narrative. So the post office learning about mail. First, each unit is a story. The first step, a letter arrives. It's a way to begin a story. How many good books have you read that start with a letter or a phone call? Like somebody has something to say, and that becomes the way you launch a story. So creating the mail carriers, thinking about who's going to deliver the mail and how is that going to happen? You can imagine in a preschool or pre-K or a kindergarten classroom saying, you know, let's create our own post office and we'll be the mail carriers. So the characters, the setting, you need mailboxes, you need places to sort the mail and figure out how it's going to be delivered. You learn more about the post office, sort of like the research or the background, like how does this really work? Like how does the mail carrier know which house to bring the mail to? So let's figure that out. So the context, developing a sense of context with your students, and then solving the problem, like what could go wrong? So whether you are teaching a StoryPath unit or whether you are helping children learn to solve problems in your classroom, either way, you can wait for the teachable moment and know that it will come, because mistakes will be made and things will go wrong. Or you could intentionally create something to be a problem to solve. Children love it when we make mistakes, right? When you say you are looking at a pretend piece of mail and it has the numbers 1, 2, 3 on it, and you look at it and it's like, I don't know where this mail should go. How are we going to figure this out? So you could present the problem to the children, right? Or something could happen. Somebody could get the wrong letter. Like, this isn't for me, this is for somebody else. How did this get here? Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? So you have a problem to solve, and that becomes the story. That's probably the most interesting part of the story. So a StoryPath unit would have that kind of problem and resolution, and everyone would work together and collaborate to figure out how to solve that problem. And StoryPath, Margaret's approach is there's always some kind of celebration at the end. And often that involves families. So if there's an opportunity to invite families into your classroom, no, right now we can't do that so much, but certainly in the future, we'll be inviting families into our classrooms again, then we could have some kind of party, and maybe we could have a letter writing party. So this is just one example of how the arc of the narrative, as developed by Margaret Maguire or by any good novelist, can be applied to a pre-K classroom, and you can build your curriculum around it. The pre-K StoryPath units do have a number of different components. There's a teacher guide, there's assessment pack where you can keep track of some of the milestones of learning along the way. There's discussion posters that you can use to deepen the knowledge of the children through pictures and through simple language. Oh, sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself. I gotta slow down. The teacher guide for pre-K StoryPath, I hope this doesn't sound like I'm putting in too much of a plug for this curriculum, but this is the coolest thing, because the teacher, just look at it. Like, does this look like any teacher guide you've ever seen? It's an illustrated teacher guide. It looks like a graphic novel, right? So within the teacher guide, where you have all of the ordinary resources you would of how you would teach a unit, there's the story of a teacher teaching this unit. And I think, the kids these days, my daughter would say, oh, that's so meta. Like, using a story to teach a story, like, that's really meta. But it's incredibly entertaining and exciting, and it's such a cool way to learn and to understand. When you get home from work, the last thing you want to do is sit and read a teacher guide with the text this small. Wouldn't you rather look at some pictures and get to know another teacher, and how did it play out, and what did they talk about, and what were the kinds of things the children said? So I think it's pretty cool. I really enjoyed working on this as an editor, so I wanted to share that with you. So let's talk more generally about learning through pretend play. This is one of the illustrations from the Zoo unit for pre-K. So let's talk about pretending. And I want to say something about the Reggio Emilia approach, because I have a quote here that I'm going to show you from Carla Rinaldi, who is one of the founders of the Reggio Emilia infant, toddler, and preschool centers in Reggio Emilia, Italy. And she said, in Italian, this has been translated, play and learning are like the two wings of a butterfly. One cannot exist without the other. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Reggio Emilia approach. Let's do just a brief sort of Zoom check-in. Can you use the raise your hand function in Zoom and raise your hand if you are familiar with Reggio Emilia? can I just get kind of a sense of, is this totally new to this audience, or do you all know about this already? Use the icon and to raise your hand, or just raise your hand if you're on video. Are you familiar with it? Melissa, anybody
Okay,
familiar?
so
Or
we
should
have 2.
3? I just saw one or 2.
You saw hand, oh, yep, 3.
So not that many. So I'm going to take a moment to say a little bit more, because I think this is something that you might enjoy learning more about later. After World War II, when Italy had been devastated by the destruction of the war, when there were literally ruins of buildings in the central Italian region of Reggio Emilia, there was a group of parents who built a school in their spare time using the rubble of the ruins, the bricks. They took the bricks, they washed them, they built a school because they wanted a future for their children that was different from what they had experienced during the war. And it became a system of publicly funded municipal schools. And one of the things that's so incredible about this model is that it's very collaborative, where parents are very closely involved. Another exceptional thing is that every school has an art studio. So the arts are fully integrated into the curriculum. It's not just a special that's done maybe once a week, or you just go and you do this thing and it's separate. But every topic of the curriculum, whether it's a post office or a butterfly, is explored through collaboration with the art teachers. So there's highly emphasized, a high emphasis on artistic expression. But the other piece of it, or one of the many pieces of it that I find really valuable, is this concept of the 100 languages of children. One of the Reggio Emilia founders wrote a poem called The 100 Languages of Children. And the idea behind it is that if we insist that the only way children can express to us what they've learned is by writing it down, like that's academic language, right? Like it's only real school unless they can write it. If we insist that that's the only language of learning, then not only are young children out of the learning process until they learn to write, but there are all kinds of other ways that children show us what they know and explore what they know and ask questions besides just with language. So drawing is a language, dance is a language, play is certainly a language. There are all kinds of languages that children use. So stories, coming back to our session today, stories are a language. Stories are a very complex language. And play is also so closely related. Play and stories are almost the same language. You can hardly separate them out. So I'm a strong adherent, as you can tell, of Reggio Emilia inspired practices, and I encourage you to explore that further. And you don't even have to believe Reggio Emilia. There's plenty of research that shows that learning through play is important. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here. You probably already know that, but I have a quote on the screen, but I'll just tell you, if you ever need to prove to parents or your colleagues that play is essential and that play supports learning, go to the website for the LEGO Foundation. And they have an incredible library of research on the value of play. They have white papers, they have articles, they have playful parenting resources for working with families. They have fantastic resources. And it's not just about Legos. It's the LEGO Foundation, which is a nonprofit global organization. So if you're looking for proof that play is important, go to the LEGO Foundation. And this is just one quote from there. Learning through play supports the development of early literacy and numeracy skills into an integrated approach, while also cultivating children's social, emotional, physical, and creative skills. So we knew that already, didn't we? All right, let's look at another example called the restaurant. And whether you use a pre-K story path curriculum or not, I bet there are children in your life who like to pretend that they're at a restaurant, especially now we can't always go to an actual restaurant. So learning about food. So what does that look like? So who is in a restaurant? Who works in a restaurant? Who visits a restaurant? Would this come up spontaneously in your classroom just because you have stuff to pretend to play restaurant, or would you facilitate that and suggest that? And how does this connect to the rest of your curriculum? Well, there's all kinds of literacy that would come up as you're talking about who works in a restaurant. And in the illustration, this is from the Illustrated Teacher Guide, where the children are contributing their ideas. The teachers are using words and images to record their ideas, and they come up with some fairly rich language around the characters in their story about the restaurant. Then they create a setting, and they can represent their setting through props, through the way they arrange the furniture in the classroom, or they can draw or paint a mural or images that show that they're in a restaurant. Teachers can facilitate that. In the picture, we have a teacher making a list of things that you would find in a restaurant. So you have your characters, you have your setting. And then the context, let's go deeper. Let's learn more about what happens in a restaurant. And again, teachers can facilitate this to make connections to other curriculum content that you are covering right now. But this is also often a good way to include parents. So in this case, if there's a parent who works in a restaurant, they could come in and maybe they could demonstrate a cooking project. And that's another way of building context. And then there's the problem solving. So what could go wrong in a restaurant? There are so many things that could go wrong in a restaurant. And in our example, in our illustrated teacher's guide, the problem was that some of the children set up a restaurant and nobody came. So what do you do when you set up a restaurant and nobody comes? There's a lot of interesting problem solving. And actually, much of that is related to social studies content in terms of economics, in terms of goods and services. So what would make someone come to your restaurant? So in this story, one of the solutions the children came up with was advertising. So they created signs that said, "Eat here now." And they had conversations about how much they were charging for the food, and they did a lot of interesting problem solving. So so that's a very simple unit, the restaurant, but it offers a lot of very rich opportunities to integrate complex content into it. And then, of course, the last part of this arc or this unit is sharing with families and inviting them to come in and celebrate the unit that you've had. All right, so let's look a little bit more. How are we doing on time? Okay. The rich conversations and social interactions. You know, we've talked about this already. The social emotional learning, we haven't talked about as much. I'm going to move a little bit more quickly because I don't want to leave out the social studies and the mapping, because I promised you I would do that. Language literacy, vocabulary, we've talked about that already. I did want to take a moment to ask for your input, though. You know how I said how a child, Vygotsky said, that a child is a head taller in play, and they're using words that they wouldn't ordinarily use. So do you have any examples of words that are special to a restaurant that a child might use spontaneously because they're mimicking something that they've heard before, or a word that you might introduce? Put it in the chat. Like, what would be some specialized language, some vocabulary words that children either would initiate themselves, or you would have an opportunity to include that word? Maybe you're working on the letter B. Are there words that start with the letter B in a restaurant? So, so write in the chat. I can't see the chat, so I'm going to count on you, Melissa. Does anybody have ideas of words that you would use in a restaurant?
We've got menu, waiter, chef, and order. Appetizer, hostess.
Mm-hmm. So those are roles. Those are menu items. What about
Dessert?
Dessert. What about other languages? You know, we go to, I go to Italian restaurants, I go to Mexican restaurants. Sometimes there are items that are in other languages, and you may have children who are speaking those languages in your classroom, and that's their home language. So it gives them an opportunity to shine when they know some of these, like the words that are on the menu, when it's from their home language or their home culture.
We also have beverage and check, please. Just
check, please. Yeah. So the social studies content, I think it's really clear in a unit like this with the restaurants, that you're talking about communities, you're talking about the economics, the buying and the selling, certainly. You're probably also talking about geography, because how can you talk about restaurants with children and not have them say, well, we go to the one over there or over there? Like they'll tell you where they go and they'll use their bodies to tell you, right? So that's a great opportunity to then go take that a step farther and look at mapping and spatial reasoning. So let's move forward to that, because I want to make sure that we get to that while we still have time. So I do have a slide here about higher order thinking, but I think, again, I'm preaching to the choir. So there's the problem solving, the critical thinking, the collaboration, and the cooperation. But let's talk about mapping. So this is a map that was created by one of my little friends at School for Little Children. And I've found that when I give the children graph paper instead of plain blank paper, they will often spontaneously make things that either are maps or resemble maps. It's really interesting. Even if you leave it open-ended and say you have a writing corner and you put graph paper in the writing corner, they'll start to draw, and they'll talk about their drawings in ways where they're using spatial reasoning in ways that they wouldn't if it was just plain white blank paper or colored paper. And when I say spatial reasoning, I'm talking about thinking and problem solving that includes the relationships of where things exist in space. I'm not a scientist, so I hope I've used the right terminology, but it has to do with certainly, oh, let me go ahead with the next slide. Mapping and spatial reasoning. It has to do with the physical kinesthetic learning of where things are. So as I was saying, you can't make a map with a child without them moving their bodies, because if they're learning it, because they're processing it in their heads, and they will have to point or they will have to move in order to express to you what they're trying to do. So there's the kinesthetic element, and young children learn so much with their bodies anyway, like they have to move to learn, but it's especially true with the spatial reasoning and the mapping. So it involves drawing, so there's that fine motor. Often it involves measuring, either with an actual measuring tool, or if you're using graph paper, they might actually be measuring by units, by the squares that's already printed on the page. Certainly geometry, we've got the relationships between shapes when you're mapping or working on paper with spatial reasoning. There's scale, the concept of scale, where, here's my favorite story about scale. I'll tell this one really quickly. When I was working at Northwestern, we had a summer course where children would build with Legos. And these were kindergarten and first grade, I think. So they would come in, and it was Lego architecture, and they would spend a whole week building with, I think we had at least 15,000 Legos in that room, and they would build and they would build and they would build. And it was great, and we loved it. But one summer, instead of just calling it Lego architecture, we called it Lego Metropolis. And they weren't just building whatever they wanted, they were creating a city. And what happened is, when the children were collaborating and building a city together, they had to talk about scale. We didn't have to tell them to do that. They had to, because if one person was building a house for a person and it was this big, and another person was building a house for a person and it was this big, well, is one a giant and one is a tiny person, or are they both people? So if they're both people, then how are we going to build them to scale? So when you start talking about scale as being sizes relative to each other, like, is a house for a dog going to be the same size as a house for a person? Like, you can do that with block play. That's when scale comes in. So it's really interesting when you're working with children and these issues of scale come up spontaneously, and they will with young children. All right, so relationships, perspective taking. Let me talk about perspective taking. When introducing children to mapping, if it hasn't come up already or you haven't already noticed it in children's play, one of the really cool ways to do that is through block play. And when you're drawing a map or creating a map or reading a map, the concept of a bird's eye view. What does a bird see when they fly through the sky? They look straight down. And when children build with blocks, if they stand up and just look down on what they built, they're essentially seeing a map of what they built. And you can take pictures from a bird's eye view. They can draw what they see from a bird's eye view. You could have them draw on big pieces of paper. You could have them build on big pieces of paper and then trace what they built. And then they have a map of what they built. And this picture on the left with the little paper cocktail umbrellas, that was something I did with my students. I used a picture book called The Yellow Umbrella. It's by Jay Sue Liu, and every illustration in that book is from a bird's, except the last one, is from a bird's eye view. I don't know if you can see up in the little corner where I'm appearing on your Zoom screen, but every illustration in the book is from above, from a bird's eye view, and you're watching people with these colorful umbrellas walking through a town. So that's a great book to use when you're doing mapping with children. So using blocks as a way to talk about a bird's eye view is really exciting. Mapping has come up in the pre-K StoryPath units, particularly to the unit on the zoo. And if you've been to a zoo, you probably have seen a map of the zoo. You've been handed a map of the zoo. There are a ton of them online that you can print out from pretty much any zoo in the world. And usually the design is really cool because they've made them for children. So usually a zoo map is an excellent example of a map, of like a first map for children, because it's usually colorful and it's usually illustrated with like little icons or little pictures of the animals. So I think this one was from, I thought it was from San Diego, but I don't think it is. But I bet you can find some. So when you're creating a map with children, you could do it on a wall as a mural. You could do it with blocks on the floor. Here's an example of some children building an enclosure for their rabbits in their zoo. And then you could take a picture or you could draw it, and then you have a map of your zoo. And one of the reasons why mapping, I think, has captured my imagination anyway, comes back to this concept of the 100 languages of children. Because when children take a 3D structure that they've built, like a zoo out of blocks, and they represent that as a two-dimensional drawing, then they're utilizing two different languages. If you think of the languages of children. So they are transposing or translating from one language into another. And every time a child goes from 3D to 2D or from 2D back to 3D, they are noticing things and learning things and discovering things and solving problems that they never would have encountered otherwise. So how hard is it? It's hard for an adult too, to look at a structure, this zoo that this child has built out of blocks and animals, and to create a drawing. But look at what this child has done. I think this child was still 3 when he did this in this picture. So he was able to do the outline. It's pretty close. It's got almost like a little point at the top, and he was able to draw that there was kind of a subsection, and he's got some lines and squiggles to represent the animals inside. That's hard to do. So what did he have to think about to do that? He probably had to think about scale. He had to think about the relationships between those shapes. He had to think about size. He had to think about placement, and maybe did some measuring of one block against another block to sort of see how they related. So there's all kinds of complex ideas that goes into translating something from one language to another language through play. One of my favorite books about maps for children is Mapping Sam by Joyce Hesselberth. And I wanted to ask for your input. If anybody has any mapping books that they really like, I thought maybe you could type that into the chat. And we're getting near the end, so I'm gonna not stop for that right now, but let's look at the end and see what's in the chat. But if you recommend a mapping book for children, put it in the chat. All right, so all of this is aligned with pre-K standards. And I know you're in different locations in the United States, and every state has its own early learning standards. But the National Association for the Education of Young Children, in terms of developmentally appropriate practice, has kind of an umbrella perspective on what is appropriate and important in the classroom. And then the National Council of Social Studies, those standards start at kindergarten, but a lot of what we're talking about today anticipates those standards and prepares children for those next steps. So I just have a couple of kind of snippets from the standards themselves so that you can see how closely what we're talking about aligns with the standards. So this is the third principle or essential idea from the NAEYC developmentally appropriate practices. Play promotes joyful learning that fosters self-regulation, language, cognitive and social competencies, as well as content knowledge. That's one of the new things that's been emphasized in the revision to developmentally appropriate practice, is this idea of content knowledge in social studies and in the mapping, the STEM learning, content knowledge across disciplines. And play is essential for all children birth through age 8. So that's from the new revised developmentally appropriate practices. And then from the National Council of Social Studies, one of the themes for K through, I think it's all the way up to through K through 12, is people, places, and environments. And everything we've talked about in the last 51 minutes is related to people, places, and environments. And the quote is, the study of people, places, environments enables us to understand the relationship between human populations and the physical world. So I hope that that statement helps you see the connection between the restaurant, the post office, the zoo, the maps. All of this is really closely integrated with the social studies content that the children are going to be encountering in kindergarten, first and second grade especially. So I did want to leave a few minutes at the end for questions and closing. Do we have any mapping books in the chat that we want to mention?
So Karen mentioned Me on the Map.
Oh yeah, that
a
one's
good
been around for a while. I remember
Yeah.
using that. Probably that was 10 years ago, but I think that's a classic. I mean, that was
Yes.
one of the first mapping books for young children. Like you can find plenty of mapping books for, third, fourth grade and above. But I think Me on the Map was one of the first ones that I saw published that was really for young children.
Yes.
Any other map books to mention?
That is all.
I really love children's books where the end paper is a map. I don't know if you've noticed that. The original Winnie the Pooh books, I think, are the best example. Not the Disney Winnie the Pooh books, but the original A.A. Milne books, which are written at a higher reading level. Young children wouldn't read those independently. But if you look at the end paper at the front and the back covers of the book, there's the map of the 100-Acre Wood, where each of the little characters, you can see Eeyore's house, and you can see Owl's tree house, and you can see Piglet's little house. That's a wonderful example of a map from children's literature. And in my recent book, Young Architects at Play, I talk a lot about spatial reasoning because, of course, with block play and architecture, that's important. And I have a theory that I think one of the reasons why children are more interested in maps and perhaps even have a greater capacity or curiosity about maps is because of technology, because parents are using their phones to get places and to map, GPS or Siri, where's the nearest grocery store. So they're seeing people use maps perhaps more, and the maps are more accessible because they're right there on the screen. And also because of drone photography. This is another one of my theories, because I see a lot of children's television has been utilizing drone photography, where the drones are, floating above, they're at the bird's eye view. And if you look at children's television 10, 15 years ago, or the original Sesame Street or any of those shows, you never saw that type of photography. Everything was, literally grounded. So that just the whole idea of children's media expanding to include these kinds of perspectives, I think might have something to do with children's interest or ability in imagining these relationships of people and places and how you get from place to place. It's just a theory that I have. Are there any questions or comments as we wrap up? Is there anything I talked about that you're already doing that you could share as an example? Do you use stories? Do you use pretend play in your classrooms?
Feel free to unmute or use the chat. These questions may be a little harder to type.
Yeah, I'm gonna actually stop sharing. So, oops,
Okay.
I thought I was going to. No, where is it? Oh, screen sharing has stopped. Okay,
Yes.
we should just see the grid now or whatever view we have, right?
Yes.
Did any of this sound familiar to you all? Do you have any teaching practices where the children take on roles and pretend?
So Abby says at her school, she uses tools of the mind and it's based on a large portion of pretend play. I saw your smile, Anne.
Yes, I've read a lot about tools of the mind, and it sounds like it's an incredible model where pretend play is really at the focus of the model, right? But also, from what I've read, there's quite a bit of focus on executive function, on children learn how to negotiate, how to collaborate, how to get along with each other through pretend play. So yeah, so tools of the mind, that's a great example.
Camber says she does as much as she can with the little resources that she is allotted in public schools, especially with COVID. I agree with you on that, Camber. It's
Yeah.
hurt my library makerspace area a little bit with having to clean. And
Yeah.
Maha says, any ideas to incorporate this into virtual learning?
I've been thinking about that because so much of the pretend play is the social interaction. I have been doing some writing and speaking on how to use block play in remote learning, where the teacher demonstrates or inspires children to do something with blocks by showing them something that he or she did with blocks. And then the children use either their own blocks or they use cardboard boxes or do other kinds of things to sort of act out and demonstrate in their own setting. So there's that. It's not as collaborative as we would want it to be, but there's a certain kind of like a call and response to it. But I'm curious. I haven't done remote. I've done only a little bit of remote teaching with children myself. I've mostly been working with teachers since the pandemic. But I'm wondering, does anybody have an example of pretending while you're on Zoom?
I have one suggestion. The speaker view in Zoom, it shows who's talking. So sometimes you can get in like a simulation or play type thing with older kids. But I was thinking maybe you could do that even with a pretend play. So whoever shows up on the screen is the one talking, and maybe they could sort of interact conversationally through that. And it may be one way to bring it in.
Yeah, the children could take on roles. I mean, it'd be harder to facilitate that over Zoom. I have seen teachers use puppets quite a bit on Zoom. And so if you were teaching a unit on something like the restaurant, then you could use a puppet to say, I'm so hungry, I wish I could go to a restaurant. I haven't been for such a long time. Let's pretend that we have a restaurant. What do we need to do to have our restaurant? And it could be done conversationally or, well, I suppose you could say to one child, well, you're the waiter. It's time for you to take the order. What would you say to our puppet friend if you were going to take their order? But it does make it harder, and it makes it harder to sustain it over time. I think if you're going to incorporate a story or pretend play into a whole unit, we're talking about in the classroom, this would take at least a week and could be potentially several weeks. So that would be harder to sustain over Zoom. So I think the digital tools that we have for storytelling, relying on excellent children's literature, really child appropriate videos, I think that those kinds of things are a good stand-in if we select them really carefully. But it's true, a lot of what I presented to you today really needs to be done in a classroom in person. And I know some of you are in person, and I hope many of you will be in person soon.
Edwina says your presentation was wonderful. Thank you, Anne, for speaking to us. And she's going to head out. Thank you, Edwina, for coming. And thank you, everyone. Let me go ahead. Maha also likes the idea of modeling how to build with blocks and puppets. I agree. I'm going to add in, and you guys can keep talking about that. I don't want to cut you off. The evaluation, and if you need a certificate for attending tonight, I'm going to add in an email that you can email and request one, and they'll send it right over to you. So I'll be doing that real quickly.
In terms of, modeling with blocks and puppets, one of the things that I've been observing and encouraging is tangible objects on both sides of the screen. So giving children something to hold and to manipulate, even if it's not part of the lesson, seems to be really helpful when children are participating in a virtual lesson. And when teachers use props, I think when the teacher uses a digital story and their face becomes very small, I think sometimes children lose interest, and it's and it depends on the child. And I don't have any data to support this, but I know that there are people out there who are studying it right now, whether the children are more engaged with the face or whether the children are more engaged with the story. And I think there is some evidence that the faces are really important, that especially if the child knows you. Like if you are a person who already has a relationship with that child and you're telling them a story and you're holding up your book like this, that for many children, they'll be more engaged in that because they know you and they like you than if you just share your screen and show them the pages of the book. I don't know if any of you have had that experience or not, but it sounds like that might be something we're going to end up learning from the pandemic.
I am surely interested to see that. One thing I did notice after being with the kids almost a whole year last year and then going into virtual was their personalities changed in some ways. Some students that were very calm and quiet in that situation, whether it was being at home or being on camera, I'm not sure, but sometimes they had a totally different personality when you saw them on Zoom, and that was interesting. So I'm interested in that research.
The Erickson Institute here in the Chicago area has a tech center, so technology and early childhood. And I know some of their researchers are looking at engagement with young children in virtual learning and trying to capture this moment and use it as an opportunity to collect some data on what works best for engaging young children. So that's one of the things they're looking at.
Very interesting. Well, again, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording and let you guys know this will conclude our webinar this evening. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. If you still have questions and comments or want to ask a question, we will go ahead and stay on, but I'm going to go ahead and close it tonight. Thank you so much, Anne. This was very exciting and interesting and absolutely important in this time period. I'm glad someone brought up the virtual side of it. So let me go ahead and stop that.